Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And today we are joined by a former commander, Joint Forces Command. General Sir Richard Barrons, during his 39-year career in the military, has served extensively in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq and Afghanistan. He's an author, a guest speaker, and currently co-chairman of Universal Defence and Security Solutions. General Barrons, great to have you on Frontline today. Thank you very much for your time. The much talk about counter-offensive in Ukraine is now, 2 weeks old. And what we're seeing effectively is a kind of cat and mouse game between the Ukrainian and Russian side, where the Ukrainians are trying to look for perhaps gaps in Russia's 1,000-kilometre long defensive line, and Russia is trying to exhaust the equipment that the Ukrainians have. Equally, the Ukrainians doing the same. When do you think there will be some kind of tangible breakthrough?
So I think the first thing we should recognise is that this counteroffensive has been about 9 months in preparation. It's taken that long to get the people into uniform, to train them, to equip them now with 9 brigades worth of NATO equipment. And a brigade is about 5,000 people, plus another 3 brigades equipped with mostly Russian stuff. And those people have had to be trained, and they've had to make a plan. And the problem with the plan is, as you say, 1,000-kilometre front line is, where do you apply a force of, say, 50,000 people in a way that you'll get the best effect? And all we've seen so far is the leading edge of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, probing Russian positions in places that matter to Ukraine, to identify what the Russian defenses really are, how good they are, and that may be a bit of a shock, in fact, and to see if they can set the conditions to apply the mass of this force. And that's a very long-winded way of saying we'll see the Ukrainian counteroffensive get rolling when they're ready, when they have worked out where to attack, and how to unsettle the Russian defense.
If it's a question of finding the right moment, then how long do you think Ukraine can keep up these probing attacks?
So because they're probing attacks, they require quite small forces, which are relatively easy to replenish. And in fact, what I think we're seeing this week, after the 2 weeks you described of poking away at the fringes of the Russian defenses, not even getting close to the main defensive areas, is they're now having a think and not really doing very much this week in terms of major activity. So they can hold this force for as long as necessary. And the reverse is really the key point here, is that if you've got a force of about 50,000 and you know you're taking on about 300,000 Russians in and around Ukraine, the very worst thing you could do is to throw it at very stiff Russian defense and just watch it batter itself into oblivion, because Ukraine doesn't have another one of these offensive forces to hand. It would take as long, again, a year to rebuild it. So way better for Ukraine to work out where it can attack and win than attack and just hope it works out. That isn't going to play well.
If this week is the week where they're having a pause and a think, if you, for example, were commanding the Ukrainian army, what kind of questions would you be asking? Where would you be asking for information?
So I'd want to know as much detail as I could, not just about the geography of the Russian defenses. And we've seen in many places that matter, the traditional 3 belts of trenches and ditches and anti-tank obstacles. You can see those from space, so that's not really a surprise. But what I want to know is, where are the Russian forces that are going to man that defensive belt? And in particular, where are the counterattack forces? Because that's the critical part of fighting your way through a defense, is you hopefully breach the enemy's trench line. And then if they're any good, they will immediately counterattack with artillery and tanks and infantry to throw you back when you're frankly at your most vulnerable. And the third thing I'd be really testing, and I think this is very different to the offences we saw last year from Ukraine, is what's the will of the Russian forces to hold this ground like? And the signs so far are the troops that they've encountered are better. They're not running away. And indeed, they may well have put their weakest troops the most liable to cut and run in the front line, and they've put better troops behind them who are pointing their guns at their own people to make sure that they stay there. So this is not just in terms of fortifications, but a much stiffer obstacle to overcome. And I'd need to know how I broke through it. And ideally, I'd need to know how I get behind it or from a flank rather than try and tackle it head on.
And add into the mix, of course, the Russian air power. And Russia has recently deployed attack helicopters along the front line. What kind of pressure is that putting on?
So this is a really important point. So an offensive requires a combination of air and land power, and the Russian Air Force has not been able to operate really any further forward than overhead its own troops. But when the Russian forces are being attacked, as they are, then the Russian Air Force is overhead their own troops, and so attack helicopters and fast jets and other forms of air power can be more easily brought to play. They're still, frankly, pretty vulnerable to the Ukrainian air defense when they bring those systems forward. And that's harder when you're trying to move forward. So we're not seeing the Russian Air Force romping around the whole of Ukraine as perhaps we thought it might a year ago. We are seeing it being more of a force in the way it helps Russia to defend the territory it's illegally occupied.
And do we have any idea how this is affecting the Ukrainian air defense systems?
So they have a very comprehensive air defense. So they actually now have the most comprehensive air defense system in Europe, and you would expect that. But it's pulled in several directions. So the weight of their effort is over Kyiv and the other major cities to fend off these almost daily attacks with drones and cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. It's a harder challenge when you're bringing air defense forward to cover an attacking force because you've got to move it. And air defense is a sort of thing, it often takes time to bed in. For example, a Patriot battery takes about 3 months to set up. So we're not talking about systems like that. But of course, when you move an air defense launcher, it's actually a bit more vulnerable. It's also not able to fire on the move. So the Ukraine military know that when they force their way into Russian positions, it's absolutely vital that they contain the pace of their advance to remain under the cover of their air defenses. And it'll be a regulator for how fast they can move forward.
And what other battlefield tactics are you seeing in the positioning of troops on either side?
So what we've seen so far is literally textbook. So from the perspective of the Russian defensive, they're generally laid out 3 lines of trenches and ditches, and they can be over an area 25 kilometers deep. So this is a big and thoughtful, formally laid out defensive position. And amongst those trench lines, they'll have positions where they can bring tanks forward to support the troops when they are engaged, and they'll have counterattack plans, and they'll have artillery fire plans, and they will have positioned ammunition and other logistics to fight the defense. And all of that you could read in almost any Russian or indeed any other national military manual. What we're seeing from the Ukrainian side is the benefit of the NATO training that they have had over the last year or so, in the way so far quite small combinations of troops in armoured vehicles supported by tanks and some artillery have probed forward. And what they're doing is they're looking to identify where the Russian positions are, because they're not all obvious from space, but mostly they're trying to identify the extent of the minefields. And it's the minefields that are proving the major challenge in finding a way through the Russian defenses so far. You clearly can't see them from overhead aerial imagery. You've kind of got to find out where they are. And what we've seen is quite well drilled small units moving forward into the minefields, finding the mines mostly because, frankly, a vehicle is getting blown up, and then responding with quite a high level of training in the way they get themselves out of that predicament. But none of that means that they have actually breached these very large, well laid out minefields.
We haven't seen the highly trained brigades deployed en masse yet. Do you have, I know the timing and finding the right moment is crucial, obviously, and that's what they're trying to do. But do you have any idea when that might happen? Is it weeks? Is it months?
So I think it's really important to time the major attack we expect to see on the basis of conditions rather than the calendar. And the two things that would mean I wouldn't apply that force as though I didn't know where I thought I could be successful, or I wasn't confident I could concentrate enough of that force to make my way through what is quite a stiff Russian defense. I would have an eye on the winter, because it'll all get more difficult when the snow comes and the ground gets hard. But the very worst thing I could do would be to be frightened by my own diary, throw the force at Russian defenses I had not really worked out where they were, and just fritter it away. And if you look at many, many examples from military history, right back, say, to the US Civil War in the 1860s, if you build a well-fortified defensive position, if you hold it with well-trained, well-led troops, it is formidably difficult to unseat it if you attack it from the front. So, and Ukraine military know this perfectly well.
When you say the conditions have to be right, you mentioned the weather, but in terms of probability of success and levels of losses that can be anticipated, what are those conditions?
So I think there are two terrible outcomes Ukraine knows not to inflict on itself, and the first is just to batter itself to pieces on the front end of a stoutly held Russian position and erode this offensive force upon which we've heaped many, and I think often unrealistic hopes. That's not going to work. And secondly, not to throw it at Russian defenses and take ground, but at such a cost in the loss of life as much as material and vehicles that it is actually a Pyrrhic victory. So we know two things are absolutely clear. One is that the force that Ukraine has assembled over the last 9 months is simply not going to be big enough to throw all Russian forces out of Ukraine this year, unless somehow Russia decided to pack it in and go, and that isn't really a credible prospect. So we think that sort of total success is out of reach, and Ukraine is basically saying so. And if we know that, then the other thing we know is this war will go on. At the end of this year, it's very hard to see that either side thinks they've lost, either side thinks they've won, and both sides will think they have more to gain by fighting. So we really know now that on the back of this counteroffensive, it should convey a sense of enough hope that the war can be won on the battlefield to justify the continued application of Ukrainian will and blood and sweat and, frankly, Western military industrial mobilization to give them the tools that they need to fight at considerable cost for probably another 2 to 3 years at least. So that's about $100 billion a year we're looking at.
And when you say Russian forces are very unlikely to pack it in and go, what effect do you think the strained relations between the Wagner group of mercenaries and the regular Russian forces will have on their ability to defend?
So it is a significant vulnerability for the Russian forces in that there are these frictions between the Russian army and its commanders and the private military companies like the Wagner Group. There are others, but the Wagner Group is the most prolific and certainly the most vocal. I mean, they operate together, but separately. And although Russia is trying to enact legislation to make organizations like the Wagner Group fall under the MOD, that's being actively resisted. But those frictions are important. But so far, they haven't unseated the Russian military activity. But it is an interesting question that were Ukraine to find the way to really press the Russians hard, whether those fractures would mean that there was an exploitable gap and it made it more likely that the Russians would withdraw or retreat. But we've seen really no sign of that in the fighting around, for example, Bakhmut so far.
And let's talk about the most recent 10-point African peace plan. The deal has been rejected by President Putin, who says it has to acknowledge new realities. Is a peace deal possible in any circumstances now?
So most wars eventually do not result in total victory by one side or the other. The Second World War, to that degree, perhaps something of an aberration. And given that the balance of forces in Ukraine today and in the way we can expect it to follow for however long this war continues, For Ukraine to throw every Russian out of Ukraine is a really big and long-term ask. For Russia to occupy more of Ukraine looks very difficult for them, although they are, much bigger and will continue to plug away at it. So the most likely outcome eventually is there'll be a stalemate on the battlefield. The point is, we're just not there yet. As I say, neither side thinks that they should give up fighting because they've nothing more to gain by continuing. There's plenty of will to shed blood in Ukraine on the part of both sides at the minute. So talking is often about timing. And whilst it's common to talk and fight at the same time, although that sounds a bit bizarre, that's generally how it happens. Right now, neither side is ready to talk, because talk means compromise, means acknowledging your country's been occupied or acknowledging you're going to leave a country that you are held to have occupied. So the will to talk just doesn't exist yet.
And one of the major underlying pressures is the soon to expire grain deal, which allows Russian food and fertilizer to be exported from 3 Ukrainian ports, without which there are likely to be global food shortages. What can be done to protect that agreement?
So there was a recognition last year that starving tens of millions of people, mostly in Africa and Asia, on the back of the war in Ukraine was in nobody's interest. And Russia knew that it was losing the support of countries that might otherwise support Russia in Africa, and indeed, I think also in Asia, particularly China. So a deal was done. The Ukraine economy is shattered by this war, but will only be depleted further if grain exports are prevented from moving during the course of this year. And now we have to factor in the dam, the blowing of the dam. It's inflicted an enormous ecological disaster on that part of Ukraine, and it is calling into question the irrigation support to a very large area of the grain growing area of Ukraine. So this question of the effect of the war in Ukraine on starvation and literally starvation in some parts of Africa is as important next year as it is this year. And this is why the international community as a whole should be trying to find ways of either limiting or making this war eventually stop on decent terms. But right now, as I've described, the will to fight continues, and the grain is as likely to be a casualty of the war as it is as likely to be kept separate from it.
There are also fears about potential attacks on pipelines, undersea cables. The unresolved attacks still remain of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline attacks. And following the NATO defence ministers meeting, a new centre has been announced in the UK to safeguard underwater cables and energy pipelines. How do you think this war is changing preconceptions we used to have about the security of Europe?
So I think Europe is on a really steep learning curve in the way it thinks about its safety and security, and we should recognise we've all enjoyed a life for about the last 30 years or so where Europe has been free from existential peril. We didn't feel we were going to be invaded. We weren't subject to really great stress or the risk of civil war, and we benefited enormously from being part of the US-led West, and we didn't have to think about existential peril. And now the world is already very different. Not only are we in this very lumpy confrontation with Russia, which I think will endure for a very long time, we're now dealing with a world which has to factor in managing the rise of China, however that goes, where for the first time mankind is bumping into the limits of its own planet's ability to put up with us, and all the opportunities and risks of the digital age. So we know this is a much more threatening environment. And part of that is realizing that confrontation and conflict is not just about weapons and people in uniform. It's about all levers of power. And indeed, we're seeing that play out in Ukraine. So if Russia wants to squeeze Europe, it's not about its missiles. It's much more about the pressure it could put on our daily economic life by cutting cables or interfering with our energy supplies or our power supplies, or indeed the way it tries to manipulate opinion through social media. This is just a feature of the modern orchestra of war, and there are very few new lessons other than technology in there, because if you look at our history and the way wars have been fought in the past, it is about all levers of power. And big wars are fought, won, and lost by civil society and civilians, helped by their military. And we've got used to, through Iraq and Afghanistan, thinking of war as something only happened abroad and only involved the regular military. And that was a historical aberration. And now we're back to much more challenging times.
And how do you assess the nuclear rhetoric that we're hearing at the moment? President Biden is saying that the claims of the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus is absolutely irresponsible and the threat of using them is real. How do you assess that? Do you think it's just talk, saber rattling, or is it a genuine threat?
So last year, on the back of the successful Ukrainian late summer, autumn offense, up particularly around Kharkiv, the Russians rolled out the nuclear rhetoric, and we know that in Russian military and political doctrine, if you are facing imminent catastrophic strategic defeat, then the resort to tactical nuclear weapons is part of their doctrine. It's planned in, and they started to raise that spectre. It was swiftly seen off by the US and in particular by China, saying that's not a road you can go down unless you want to be cast into the outer darkness of the international community for the foreseeable future. In other words, the price is just way too high. And many people thought, well, that's the nuclear issue settled here. The war will be confined to Ukraine. It won't be a war between Russia and the West, which would raise the nuclear spectre again. And yet, the tactical nuclear issue has come up again. And I think this is a sign of how fragile President Putin and his regime are beginning to feel. And they would be worried by the Ukrainian counteroffensive in being really successful and inflicting a battlefield defeat on Russia, even if they're still holding quite a large part of Ukraine at the end of it. And the dynamics of this have not really changed. The military reality is that a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine of, say, up to 50 kilotons would be devastating in the area that it's used. And that area would be about the size of a largest town and its surroundings. It's absolutely devastating. It would not necessarily mean in any way an escalation to the country-killing strategic weapons that Russia and America and others point at each other. And this is really the disturbing thing, is that there are people in the Russian military who see the use of tactical nuclear weapons as actually usable and don't see the necessary path to escalation that they mean. But it would breach such a taboo. It would set such a terrible precedent. It would mean that nuclear proliferation throughout the world accelerated dramatically. That actually, so far, wiser counsels have prevailed. And here I think the key card is China saying to Russia, do not do that if you want to maintain the sort of support that you rely on right now.
I mean, the war has certainly challenged our established views of 21st century warfare, and we've moved from a focus on counterinsurgency to these close combat trench warfare that we see now, coupled with the use of drones, communications disruption. Does it not need a major NATO rethink on how we plan for future wars?
So we're being reacquainted with two important things. One is we're reacquainted with the idea of war as this aspect of the human condition, this brutal, feral, destructive, unbounded thing that's been a feature of our entire existence. And some of us, not frankly me, had declared that we'd gone post-conflict at the end of the Cold War, that we wouldn't do this kind of thing anymore. We'd outgrown it. That was just nonsense. And we're seeing in Ukraine what war is really like. And the weapons that are being applied in Ukraine are the same weapons that could be applied anywhere in Europe if we had a war with Russia or, frankly, with anybody else. We've also been reacquainted with the thought that how war is fought changes all the time with technology and thinking. And this is an evolution. And what we're seeing in Ukraine is some old news, which is if you're fighting for territory, the dominant weapon is artillery. It can strike anywhere within range, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it's absolutely devastating. And where you have artillery, and it remains the biggest killer now, just as it was in the Second World War and the First World War. But where you have artillery, you'll need armoured vehicles, and you'll dig trenches because that's how you protect yourself. And ground will be contested by people with rifles and bayonets and machine guns and artillery. That's how a war for territory is fought. So we're being reminded that if we thought war was about some cyber activity and a couple of tweets, we were completely wrong. We're also seeing the evolution of missiles and cyber. So the whole orchestra of war is changing, and that's what NATO is beginning to reflect in its new NATO force model.
And if this war does last for months and years to come, where do you think President Putin will be thinking? Because some commentators are already saying that he seems to be strangely absent in his rhetoric, despite what other people have been saying about nuclear weapons, and he himself as well. That he seems to be perhaps separating himself, where standing back. The commander-in-chief is not the one making all the big statements necessarily. Do you think that he's trying to distance himself so that he has someone he can use as a scapegoat should it not work out how he wants it to?
So I think President Putin, if he's at all rational, and we must assume that he is, must be a very nervous man, at least in part, because the war he intended to have in Ukraine has not gone at all well. They have not neutered Ukraine as a country. They have not broken the Ukrainian military. President Putin has done more for NATO and NATO security than anybody. In fact, if in any month President Putin wanted to run for NATO Employee of the Month, he would win for all that he's done for the enhancing the alliance. And he doesn't really know how this ends. He's not really in any fear right now of losing, because Russia is so much bigger than Ukraine. There's a war confined to Ukraine. One way or another, in its stubborn way, they believe they will outlast Western support for the sort of fighting that we're seeing now. But he will need somebody to blame for the failure, and frankly, he's got quite a lot of people to choose between. So you'd expect to see him distancing himself a bit from the daily conduct of the war in order to have other people to blame. But many people in Russia will know he is the guy in charge. And in the end, if this is a poor outcome for Russia, the blame will go to President Putin, because the generals and the security people and the oligarchs and many in the population at large will understand it was their leader that took them into this, and maybe they should eventually have a new leader. They are nowhere near having that discussion now.
With the counteroffensive already underway, the need for weapons and equipment will not get any smaller. How do you think the Western allies are going to be able to keep up with that demand?
So I think this is the absolutely vital question for the NATO summit in July and for us all. So the war in Ukraine has been very largely supported by the weapons and ammunition that Western militaries had on the shelf, and those have largely been depleted or indeed exhausted. At the back end of this counteroffensive, Ukraine will hope to prove that it needs to be supported, and that will have to be massive support from Europe in particular. It can only be done by mobilizing Western defense industry at the expense of Western taxpayers. A bill of somewhere around 100 billion euros spread around the West a year seems to me about the right figure. So far, that mobilization hasn't really happened. There have been moves towards it. There's lots of rhetoric, but contracts have not been let. But if Ukraine is to be enabled to fight the war we keep saying is really important for our own security, the only way it can do that is if we now mobilize our own defense industry at our own expense.
General Sir Richard Barrons, really good to have you on Frontline today. Thank you very much for your time. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer, and to you for watching. See you next time.